January 17, 1945. Piedmont, Baltic Coast. The wind cuts across the frozen estuary like a blade. Inside Assembly Hall 4, beneath concrete walls thick enough to withstand bombing, German engineers in grease-stained coveralls guide a 46-foot missile onto its transport cradle. The V-2 rocket Vergeltungswaffe 2 Vengeance Weapon 2 gleams under arc lamps, its black and white checkered hull a pattern meant for tracking during flight tests, now retained because there's no time, no paint, no reason to change anything anymore. The men work in silence, broken only by the hiss of hydraulics and the metallic groan of steel against steel. Outside, beyond the barbed wire and the guard towers, the Baltic turns gray and indifferent. Somewhere over the North Sea, formations of American bombers are already forming up, their contrails writing equations of destruction across the winter sky. But here, in this moment, 5 men are torquing bolts on a weapon that was supposed to change everything. The V-2 was born from desperation dressed as genius. When Albert Speer stood before Adolf Hitler in the summer of 1943 and promised that liquid-fueled rockets would rain terror upon London, he was not lying, he was hoping. The German war machine, that juggernaut which had crushed Poland in weeks and brought France to its knees in 40 days, was by 1943 discovering what Napoleon and a dozen other conquerors had learned before. That conquest is easier than occupation, and that enemies who refuse to surrender cannot be defeated by conventional means alone. The Luftwaffe, once the spear tip of Blitzkrieg, was being ground down over the English Channel and the Russian steppes. German cities were burning under RAF night raids and American daylight bombing. The U-boat fleet, which had nearly strangled Britain in 1942, was being hunted into extinction by improved sonar and long-range patrol aircraft. Germany needed a miracle. It needed a weapon that could strike without warning, that could not be intercepted, that could bypass the growing Allied air superiority, and reach into the heart of enemy cities with impunity. The V-2 was that weapon. In theory. In practice, the V-2 program consumed resources like a furnace consumes oxygen. Each missile required 30 tons of potatoes to produce the ethyl alcohol fuel that fed its engine. Each ton of potatoes could have fed 100 soldiers for a month. Each missile needed precision parts manufactured in underground factories by slave laborers who died by the thousands from malnutrition, disease, and brutality. The Mittelwerk facility beneath the Harz Mountains, where most V-2s were assembled, became a charnel house where 20,000 concentration camp prisoners perished, more than died from the missiles themselves when they fell on London, Antwerp, and other Allied cities. Engineers like Wernher von Braun, who would later become an American hero of the space age, worked alongside SS officers who treated human beings as disposable components. The missiles themselves were complex, temperamental, and expensive. Each V-2 cost approximately 100,000 Reichsmarks, roughly the same as building 4 Panzer IV tanks or 8 Me-109 fighter planes. Between September 1944 and March 1945, Germany launched approximately 3,000 V-2 missiles at Allied targets. Historical records confirm that about 2,000 were successfully produced and deployed in combat operations. They killed approximately 7,250 people, mostly civilians. They destroyed no military targets of strategic value. They did not alter the trajectory of the war by a single degree. What German engineers expected was vindication. What they experienced was irrelevance. Across the Atlantic, a different kind of weapon was being manufactured on a scale that defied comprehension. The consolidated B-24 Liberator was not revolutionary. It was not a miracle weapon. It was a 4-engine heavy bomber that could carry 8,000 pounds of bombs over 2,000 miles, operated by a crew of 10, built from aluminum, steel, rubber, and plexiglass. It was not graceful like the B-17 Flying Fortress, nor was it beloved by its crews, who nicknamed it the Flying Coffin because its fuel tanks were prone to catastrophic fires when hit. But the B-24 had one quality that transcended elegance or affection. It could be mass-produced. Between 1940 and 1945, American factories built 18,482 B-24 Liberators, more than any other American military aircraft in history, more than any other bomber produced by any nation during the war. At the Willow Run plant outside Detroit, Henry Ford's engineers created an assembly line 3,000 feet long, where a new B-24 rolled off the line every 63 minutes at peak production. Workers, many of them women who had never held a rivet gun before 1942, built bombers the way Ford had once built Model T automobiles, with precision, efficiency, and an almost casual disregard for the supposed complexity of the task. The numbers tell a story that narratives often obscure. Germany's entire wartime aircraft production from 1939 to 1945 totaled approximately 119,000 planes of all types: fighters, bombers, transports, trainers. The United States produced 324,750 aircraft in the same period, nearly 3 times as many, while simultaneously building the world's largest navy and supplying equipment to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and a dozen other allies. The Ford Willow Run plant alone employed 42,000 workers at its peak. It operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It had its own fire department, its own police force, its own network of dormitories and cafeterias. It consumed enough electricity to power a city of 300,000 people. It was, in its own way, as much a wonder weapon as any rocket, but its wonder lay not in innovation but in replication, not in genius but in the stubborn application of industrial logic to the problem of war. German observers who studied American production methods in the 1930s had warned their superiors that the United States possessed an industrial capacity that dwarfed Europe's combined output. These warnings were dismissed. Hitler himself believed that American society, mongrelized and weakened by democracy and materialism, could never match German discipline and will. Albert Speer, who as Minister of Armaments understood the mathematical realities better than most, later wrote in his memoirs that he knew by 1943 that the war was lost, that Germany could not outproduce its enemies, but that the machinery of the Nazi state, once set in motion, could not be stopped or redirected. It could only accelerate toward its own destruction. The V-2 program was emblematic of this delusion. Vast resources poured into a weapon that sounded impressive in briefings, but which could never be produced in sufficient quantities to matter strategically, while the enemy built simple, effective weapons in quantities that blotted out the sun. In late 1944, a Luftwaffe intelligence report captured from a downed reconnaissance plane included an analysis of a B-24 raid on the Plosti oil fields in Romania. The report's author, whose name has been lost to history, noted with evident despair that the Americans had dispatched 178 Liberators on the mission, lost 54 aircraft, a catastrophic loss rate of 30%, and yet had returned 3 weeks later with an even larger formation, as though the first raid's losses were merely an accounting error to be corrected. They replaced bombers, the report concluded, the way we replace rifle ammunition. This was not entirely true. American aircrews mourning lost friends would have resented the comparison, but the observation contained a kernel of terrible truth. American production capacity was such that aircraft losses, which would have crippled the Luftwaffe, were, for the U.S. Army Air Forces, painful but sustainable. Germany could not afford to lose 50 aircraft in a single day. America lost 50 and built 75 more before the war. The symbolic weight of this disparity was not lost on those who lived through it. Every V-2 that roared off its launch pad in Holland or Germany represented weeks of labor, meticulous engineering, the diversion of scarce resources, the deaths of enslaved workers. It flew for 5 minutes, reached an altitude of 55 miles, the edge of space itself, and then fell to Earth at 3 times the speed of sound, delivering 1 ton of high explosive with no more accuracy than an artillery barrage. If it struck a building, people died. If it struck a street, the crater could be measured and the debris cleared. The explosion was over before the sound of the missile's approach arrived, a fact that made the V-2 terrifying, but also, in a great practical sense, less demoralizing than the V-1. One flying bomb buzzed overhead like a malevolent insect that gave people time to dress and next. The government suppressed accurate reports of where V-2s were landing, fearing that the Germans would use the data to improve their targeting. In truth, the missiles' guidance systems were so primitive that no amount of data could have made them precise. They were terror weapons that did not terrify enough, vengeance weapons launched by a regime that had run out of time for vengeance. Meanwhile, every B-24 that lifted off from an airfield in England literally represented something else, the conversion of American fallout transformation of defensive consent into interventionist action, the harnessing of a continent's worth of resources to a single purpose. The B-24 was loud, uncomfortable, and dangerous to fly. Its crews called it the Spam K and complained about its high stall speed and the way it could snap into an unrecoverable spin if mishandled. but it carried them to targets that German rockets could never reach: the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, the synthetic oil refineries at Lund, the marshalling yards at Munich, the submarine pens at Lorient. It struck again and again, day after day, grinding down not just German infrastructure, but German morale, German hope, the belief that superior will could triumph over superior resources. By the winter of 1945, the Luftwaffe had been swept from the skies. German jets, the Me-262, another miracle weapon, shot down a few dozen bombers and then vanished, grounded by lack of fuel and runways cratered by previous raids. The V-2s kept flying, their launches visible from miles away as columns of flame tore through the gray Baltic mornings, but fewer of them now, as the launch sites were overrun by advancing Soviet and Allied armies, as the factories producing them fell silent, as the engineers who built them began to contemplate surrender. There exists in the archives of the Imperial War Museum in London a letter written by a British civil defense worker who witnessed a V-2 strike in Islington in January 1945. She describes arriving at the scene to find a crater 30 feet wide and houses collapsed like cardboard. She describes the silence of the survivors, how they did not scream or weep but simply stared at the rubble, trying to understand what had happened. And then she describes hearing, faintly, the sound of distant engines, American bombers on their way to Germany, flying in formation so large that the sound was like thunder that never ended. "We knew," she wrote, "that for every bomb that fell here, 100 would fall there. We knew that the people who sent that rocket were themselves living in ruins now. We knew that they had lost." This knowledge did not comfort her. It did not bring back the dead. But it settled over the scene like a cold certainty, the arithmetic of industrial war made manifest. The transformation this engendered was not immediate, but it was inevitable. German soldiers and civilians who survived the war carried with them the memory of American abundance encountered in ways both subtle and overwhelming. When Wehrmacht troops captured American supply depots in the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, they found warehouses stocked with goods that seemed to belong to a different reality. Canned fruit, chocolate bars, cigarettes, new boots, winter coats, gasoline in quantities sufficient to fuel an entire Panzer division for weeks. They found tank crews who threw away socks after wearing them once because new ones were easier to requisition than doing laundry. They found medical supplies in such abundance that field hospitals discarded bandages that German doctors would have boiled and reused. These discoveries demoralized German troops more effectively than propaganda ever could because they revealed a lie at the heart of Nazi ideology: that spirit could conquer matter, that could triumph over resources, that Germany's disciplined poverty was superior to America's wasteful wealth. The truth, written in mountains of supplies and fleets of aircraft, was that America could afford to be wasteful and still outproduce its enemies. The truth was that democracy, far from weakening a nation, had unleashed productive capacities that authoritarian systems could not match. After the war, when Wernher von Braun and more than 100 other German rocket scientists were brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip, they found themselves working for the nation they had tried to bomb into submission. Von Braun, who had joined the Nazi Party and the SS, who had toured the Mittelwerk factory and surely seen the skeletal prisoners dying as they assembled his rockets, was given a new life in Alabama and later at NASA. He became the public face of the American space program, a symbol of redemption and scientific progress. But in his private papers, now held at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, there are hints of what he thought when he first arrived in the United States and saw the scale of American industry firsthand, not through intelligence reports or propaganda, but with his own eyes. He wrote to a colleague in 1946 that the Willow Run plant, which he toured as part of his orientation, had produced more bombers than Germany had produced rockets of all types during the entire war, and that the plant had been just one of dozens. "We were building precision instruments," he wrote. "They were building the future." The B-24 itself, that workhorse bomber, faded into obsolescence within years of the war's end. Thousands were scrapped, melted down, their aluminum recycled into peacetime goods. A few were converted into cargo planes or tankers and flew for decades in civilian service. Some ended up as firebombers, dropping water on forest fires across the American West, a final irony for aircraft designed to drop incendiaries on German cities. But their true legacy was not in what they accomplished as individual machines, but in what their production represented. The proof that democratic societies, when mobilized, could outperform totalitarian ones not because of superior ideology in the abstract, but because of superior systems in the concrete. The assembly lines that built B-24s were staffed by workers who belonged to unions, who could quit their jobs if they chose, who were paid decent wages, and went home at night to houses they owned. The factories that built V-2s were staffed by slaves who were worked to death and replaced with more slaves when they collapsed. One system was sustainable. The other was not. There is a photograph, taken in May 1945, of a field in Germany where captured V-2 missiles lie on their sides like fallen trees, awaiting inspection by Allied intelligence officers. The missiles are intact, their checkered hulls gleaming in the spring sunlight, their engines exposed where technicians have removed inspection panels. In the background, barely visible, is the tail section of a crashed B-24, one of thousands of Allied aircraft that went down over occupied Europe. The photograph is in black and white, and the contrast is stark. The elegant, futuristic missiles lying useless on the ground, the crude, functional bomber reduced to scrap, and yet the bomber's nation victorious. The photographer, an American Army sergeant, captioned the image in his personal album. What they built. What we built. Guess who won? Epilogue arrives not with trumpets, but with the quiet accumulation of evidence. In the decades after 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union, another nation that had learned to mass-produce weapons during the war, divided the German rocket scientists between them and built intercontinental ballistic missiles that could deliver nuclear warheads across oceans in 30 minutes. These missiles were the children of the V-2, perfected and made reliable, no longer terror weapons, but instruments of apocalyptic deterrence. Yet the logic that governed their existence was the same logic that had governed the B-24 production lines, that wars between industrial powers would be decided not by individual acts of brilliance, but by sustained capacity to produce, to replace, to endure. The Cold War remained cold in part because both sides understood that a hot war would be won not by whoever struck first, but by whoever could absorb the first strike and still retaliate. A question of depth, of redundancy, of resources mobilized over years and decades. The V-2 was a weapon ahead of its time, built by a regime that had run out of time. The B-24 was a weapon perfectly suited to its moment, built by a nation that had time and resources to spare. One was a symbol of what could be imagined. The other was a symbol of what could be achieved. In the end, imagination without capacity is merely a sketch, a blueprint, a promise unfulfilled. Capacity without imagination is blunt and ugly, but it is also real, tangible, sufficient. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, rusting beneath miles of cold water, are the remains of German U-boats sunk by B-24 Liberators flying convoy patrol, their depth charges guided by radar systems that turned the ocean surface into a transparent map. Somewhere in Belgian fields, markers commemorate the civilians killed by V-2 strikes that came without warning and ended without explanation. Somewhere in archives and museums, the artifacts remain. A V-2 engine mount, a B-24 control yoke, photographs of assembly lines and launch sites, reports detailing production numbers and loss rates. The objects persist, but the meaning they carried has transformed. They are no longer symbols of terror or hope, but evidence of a truth that every generation must learn again, that freedom and abundance are not antithetical, but intertwined, that societies which trust their people produce more than societies which enslave them, that the future belongs not to those who build the most impressive weapons, but to those who build the most weapons, period. And that victory in industrial war comes not from genius, but from the steady, unglamorous work of turning resources into results day after day, until the enemy has nothing left to answer with. The wind still cuts across Piedmont, though the launch pads are ruins now, and the assembly halls house museums. Tourists walk where engineers once worked, and plaques explain what happened here, the ambition and the atrocity, the rockets that reached space, and the slaves who died building them. And in the sky above, contrails still cross the Baltic, but they are passenger jets now, flying routes that connect cities that once tried to destroy each other. The missiles are silent. The bombers are retired. The war is over, and the future, that future written in assembly lines and production quotas, in the stubborn belief that democracy could be defended by making it materially superior to its enemies, endures, imperfect and ongoing, abundant and free.